Good morning. Good morning and welcome to First Unitarian Church of Providence, where we love beyond belief. We welcome you whoever you are, whomever and however you love, and whatever you may or may not believe. My name is Neil Bartholomew. I'll be your worship associate today. And a special welcome to those of you joining us remotely from wherever you may be nearby or far away. During the summer, while our ministers are away, the worship committee hosts a series of services which are led by church members and friends, with music also provided by church members and friends. This morning, we are pleased to have John Green as our speaker. As you will hear today, John grew up in the South, came to Rhode Island to attend RISD, and has been coming to First U along with his wife Nancy for over 30 years, and it's not quite 40, I don't think, but okay. So they eloped 40 years ago, but they weren't here until a little bit later than that. Contrary to what is in your order of service, Claire Rosenbaum will be accompanying the hymns today. Linda Gully will be doing it next week. She'll be doing a lot of stuff next week in the way of music. You'll hear about that at the end of today's service. But today it is Claire Rosenbaum who will be playing our organ. We get to hear the organ today. And the other music will be played by Francisco Izaza and myself. We have historically not encouraged applause during the course of our worship services, as they are worship services rather than performances. Recently, applause in the middle of the service have become more of a regular practice, but in order to maintain the sacred quality of the space, today let's try to return to the practice of letting the silence between worship elements enter into us. Having said that, today is the day we have been given. Let us embrace it, dance with it, with this music, you can't help it, and make it come alive, starting right now. It's going to take us a moment since I'm playing multiple roles. Please join in the unison reading printed in your order of service for the chalice lighting. This light burns also in our hearts, and it lights our path towards harmony, justice, and hope for all. Now is our time for greeting each other. Please turn to those around you or wander up the aisle a little ways to greet someone you may not already know, or folks around you that you maybe don't already know. And don't forget to turn to the camera and wave to the people watching at home. As we find our way back to our seats, John, this glass is for you. Please turn again to your order of service where we will read together the Church Covenant. We, the members of the First Unitarian Church of Providence, with respect for the worth and dignity of each person, with wonder at the light we know by many names, and with gratitude for our deep connection to each other and to the larger web of existence, covenant to walk together in our search for truth, seeking the paths of wisdom, compassion, and justice. And reach for your hymnal, and we'll do, and rise in body or spirit, and we will do hymn number 96, I Cannot Think of Them as Dead. take your seat, hang on to your hymnal, and turn to responsive reading number 584, A Network of Mutuality. I cannot read this with the power of its author, but together we will bring it what power we can. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. There are some things in our social system to which all of us ought to be maladjusted. We must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. Before it is too late, we must narrow the gaping chasm between our proclamations of peace and our lowly deeds which precipitate and perpetuate war.
One day we will come to see that peace is not merely a distant goal that we seek, but a means by which we arrive at that goal.
We must pursue peaceful ends through peaceful means. We shall hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. We now hear the joys and sorrows of the people in our congregation, as written in the book at the back of the meeting house. Our partner church in Transylvania carved the beautiful candlestick pedestal for the large candle from which we light our individual candles of joy and sorrow. Tomorrow is the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington. Hadn't even thought about that when we chose the reading that we just did. Let us take pause to remember the dreamer, and let us remain committed to doing the work. A candle of sorrow and gratitude to Joyce and Richard Buber as they mourned the death of Jane, for whom they provided such long, compassionate care. Joy and sorrow with the recent departure of my daughters back to college on the West Coast. And there's a little heart and a peace sign. Proud that First U has renewed its status as a welcoming congregation. And that was from Steve McCloy, who checked the little box, says, yes, you can read my name. So thank you, Steve. And thank you, Steve, for everything you did to make that happen. And another candle, sending light and love to Joyce and Richard, who are caring for a dear friend. We were all just walking each other home. Friends, let us rest in gladness that we have each other to share in our joys and sorrows. It makes all the difference. We'll now have a period of silent meditation, which I will precede by a very brief reading. It also is actually a reading from the back of our hymnal by W.E.B. Du Bois. The prayer of our souls is a petition for persistence, not for the one good deed or single thought, but deed on deed and thought on thought, until day calling unto day shall make a life worth living.
Good morning. First thing, I'd just like to thank all of you for being here today. I'd like to thank Neil and Francisco for their wonderful contributions. And of course, I'd like to thank my wife, Nancy, for helping me put this together too. She's the one that's hooked up to the 21st century. And it hasn't even been a year since I got the first cell phone I ever owned in my life. So. This morning, I offer for your consideration something I have entitled Reflections on the Talk. As always, I stand before you in the spirit of sharing and in the spirit of healing. When we were kids, my brothers, my sisters, and I all gradually came to think of our mom and dad as being, well, something akin to good luck talismans. That's because to us, they always seem to meet life's daily challenges with such grit as well as grace under fire. So we pretty much felt like nothing bad could ever happen to us as long as they were alive. Of course, even as kids, we knew there were such things as our being mortal, the weather, illnesses and accidents, things that not even our mom and dad could fend off. So in those moments, we'd rely instead on a combination of acceptance, equanimity, and resilience to see us through. And yet, for every individual the world over of an oppressed and marginalized community, while having resilience is certainly important, it's never been enough. That's because for generations in such communities, it's also been the custom, born out of a practical necessity, for our elders, loved ones, friends, and families to impart additional life guidance. Specifically, guidance on how best to deal with a decidedly hostile larger world. Specifically, how best to navigate through those minefields of discrimination that have been purposely sown to deter or stop us. Minefields, many of which we find ourselves still repeatedly having to cross, hence the talk. The specifics vary depending on which oppressed community we're talking about, but in every such talk, you can be sure there are no doubts being raised about whether bigotry exists or not. In every such talk, know that the logistics of survival run paramount. In this heads-up conversation, among other things we are made aware of is just what we're up against, what we need to look out for. Things like how to present oneself, how and when to speak, where to go, and when, if ever. When my parents were kids growing up in Selma, Alabama, the talk they got informed them they could only go as far as third grade, and that all they could ever aspire to be were sharecroppers. They learned, too, that they could be accosted or even killed for simply looking a white person in the eyes when speaking to them, or for failing to walk out into the street if they encountered any white person on the same sidewalk, and especially for failing to go to the back of the bus. When I was a kid, Black Americans, regardless of age or gender, remained routinely subject to harassment, injury, and wrongful death at the hands of white vigilantism, law enforcement, and the courts, doled out with a malignant business-as-usual impunity that only recently shows any signs of seriously being challenged. At no time, however, as children, did my siblings and I ever worry about where we sat on a bus. Nevertheless, we slowly began to realize that now we too had inherited the danger. The injustice, fear, hatred, ignorance, and terror imposed upon my parents was now being visited upon their children. This wasn't some dust-covered relic from their past. Bigotry was, and still remains, a toxic and an endemic rite of passage. First and foremost, Mom and Dad let us know racism was wrong, and yet it had a long history here. We learned there were really no institutions or places in America we could go where racism didn't exist. Mom and Dad let us know we were as worthy as anyone, and that we were never being terrorized and oppressed for any crimes we'd actually committed. We, instead, were being made to suffer simply on the basis of just being who we are. The unfairness of this revelation as it sank in made it hard for me to breathe. My young heart became filled with such sadness, such anger, a haunting sense of vulnerability, and a great many unanswered questions. Even as kids, it was obvious to my siblings and I that our parents had never been able to shield us, let alone themselves, from a lifelong, firsthand experience with racism, its trauma, its damning aftershocks, or the specter of its ultimate consequence from hovering over our heads. Hence, the talk. Mom and Dad well understood that even if justified, Black people weren't given the same latitude white people always took for granted in being able to publicly express strong emotions without fear of reprisal. So Mom and Dad also preached that we not let our emotions get the better of us, and instead plant the seeds for future hopes by securing an education. That being said, I can vividly recall opening one of my grade school textbooks. Inside the front cover, I found two small squares. One had the word colored next to it, and the other square, the word white. The square marked colored had a check mark inside it. I found out years later that every textbook marked like mine was at least 10 years older than the textbooks white school kids were being issued. When I look back and consider the impact of what Mom and Dad told us about the dynamics and the extent of institutional racism and of white supremacy, I think about how it must have made them feel to have to tell us such things. I do know they never intended for me to ever hate this country, but despite its lofty ideals, I did for a while. I do know they never wanted me to envy, fear, or to hate white people, because we're all God's children, they said. But I did for a while. And I know they never meant for me to ever think less of myself, abandon hope, or lower my expectations, but I did for a while. In many ways, we're still fighting the same battles, but I know things have gotten better. But what does that really mean? How do I quantify such a statement? Well, for me, it boils down to an awareness of unquestionably persistent hopes, fueling the efforts of consciousness raising by means of protest, and by the subsequent passage of legislation to address issues of inequity. I see progress, too, because the advent of social media, and especially cell phone cameras, have given people who act in good faith less room for denial about the prevalence of racism and its consequences for our collective and individual lives. I see progress, too, by simply comparing notes between generations. For example, some of the ridiculous and demeaning protocols whose violation could get my parents killed no longer apply. Because of these factors, I believe expectations are on the rise, but I take nothing for granted, because I've also come to feel that in America, progress, or the lack thereof, in terms of social justice, is largely a reflection of what white Americans at any given time are feeling either the most or the least threatened by. I also believe that unlike scientific progress, social justice never progresses in a linear fashion. As in the ice ages, sometimes the glaciers advance, sometimes they retreat. It is this one step forward, two steps back fact of our national life that serves to underscore the continuing relevance of having the talk. Now, as someone who has been both recipient and giver of the talk, I've acquired multifaceted levels of discomfort. For one, I find myself saddened and dismayed that this conversation still has to be held. My child not only has to deal with the malicious and absurd construct of racism, but also with the bigotry towards those defining themselves as transgender. What concerns me almost as much, however, are what I know to be unintentional side effects. Have I unwittingly taught my child to expect and to accept less? Have I unwittingly instilled in my child a level of fears and doubts that will hold him back? Will my child interpret pleas to play it safe as me not pushing back against bigotry and thus encourage them to do the same? Acceptance of bigotry not only ensures its survival, but also guarantees an ever-lengthening list of its casualties, beginning with hope. I remind you, we need only accept what we cannot control, what we cannot change. In the history of this republic, there have always been those among us acting in good faith who understand that in striving to become a more perfect union, there are certain changes we can and we must make. But in this life, it would still seem that for so many of us, equality remains too threatening a proposition. It would still seem that far too many of us can't feel good about themselves unless they're holding someone else back. And it would seem there are still far too many of us who truly don't care enough, one way or the other. But to those of you here today acting in good faith towards all human beings, I cannot overstate the urgency of now, because now is all any of us can ever have. So now is always the time to be part of an ongoing dialogue that gives rise to a growing consensus, one that will finally set in motion the dismantling of long-standing structural barriers that mock and cripple our nation's potential, barriers that should have no place whatsoever in a democracy. Yes, now is always the time to stand up for the sake of love. Now is always the time to stand up for the sake of justice. Now is always the time to stand up for the sake of fairness and inclusion. Yes, now is always the time to do what we can to hasten the coming of the day when having the talk is no longer required. Thank you.
And please rise in body or spirit and join in hymn number 108, My Life Flows On in Endless Song. Introduce the offering. We're just going to see what happened to our instruments in the interim. So now is the time when we take the offertory, or take the offering for the mission and vision of this church. We are a spiritual community who govern ourselves through democratic process and support ourselves through our own collective generosity. This is it. This is how all of this happens. This building, our incredible staff, keeping the lights on, all of that happens. It is paid for by us, nobody else. It all comes from us. So the offering for the mission and vision of this church will now be gratefully received. As always, thank you for all that you give, all that you do, and all that you are. Our service next Sunday will be presented by poet, author, and activist Ravi Shankar, whose talk is titled Impuritan Thinking, the Necessity of Furious Compassion. And the music next week will be played by Linda Gully, who, while she was incorrectly listed in this week's order of service, she will be correctly listed in next week's order of service. And she will be doing music of George Gershwin, as well as an arrangement by jazz pianist George Shearing. Fabulous stuff. Be there to hear it. I won't be there. I got a private hearing of this music. It's awesome. You got to come. And come hear Ravi speak also. It's great. The week after that will be our water communion service. It starts at 10:30, but come early because there's kind of a tradition that people hang out and schmooze outside the Benefit Street entrance, and for a while just kind of greet each other and chat for a while. You can reunite with all the people who haven't been coming to summer services and tell them what they've been missing. And be sure to check the First U Times. Our weekly newsletter is the single source for news, events, and everything that is happening at First Unitarian. First U Times is sent by email to all members, friends, and others who sign up to receive it. You can sign up on the church website. You can sign a registry in the back of the meeting house. You can talk to Jen Nardone, who's standing back there, and that sort of thing. And so now, let us do the unison chalice extinguishing in your order of service. We carry the flame of peace and love and hope until we meet again.